Right now, if you got lost, you'd pull out a phone, and within seconds, a blue dot would tell you exactly where you are on Earth. You probably don't think of this as remarkable. It's just what phones do. But strip away the satellites, the screens, the printed maps, even the compass, and you're left with a question that should terrify you. How do you figure out where you are and where you're going using nothing but your own senses? The answer isn't guesswork. It isn't luck. It's one of the oldest and most quietly impressive skill sets your species ever developed, and most of it left no trace at all. You'd assume that before maps, people just wandered, that early humans moved in vague directions, hoping to bump into food or water, correcting course by trial and error. It's a comforting idea, mostly because it makes you feel better about getting turned around in a parking garage, but it's almost entirely wrong. Long before anyone drew a coastline on a wall or scratched a trail onto bark, humans were navigating with a level of precision that modern people, dependent on GPS, would find almost unsettling. Start with the Polynesians, because they're the clearest proof that no maps does not mean no system. Long before Europeans reached the Pacific, Polynesian navigators were crossing thousands of miles of open ocean between islands separated by nothing but water in double-hulled canoes, without a compass, a sextant, or a single written chart. They did it by reading the ocean itself. Wave patterns bounce and refract off islands long before those islands are visible, and a trained navigator could feel the change in swell direction through the hull of the canoe, sometimes lying down to sense it better. Star paths mattered too. Navigators memorized which stars rose and set at which points on the horizon during different seasons, essentially using the sky as a slowly rotating compass. Add in the flight patterns of land-nesting birds, the color of the water, the shape of clouds sitting over an island that was still below the horizon, and you get a navigation system built entirely out of paying obsessive attention to the natural world. This wasn't folklore. It was rigorous, teachable, testable knowledge, passed from master to apprentice over years, and it got people to islands the size of a football stadium in the middle of an ocean the size of a continent. Here's the part that tends to surprise people. This tradition nearly vanished. By the mid-20th century, some scholars assumed Pacific settlement had happened by accident, boats blown off course and getting lucky. It took navigators like Mau Pialug, trained in the traditional methods of the Caroline Islands, to prove otherwise. In 1976, he sailed the canoe Hokula from Hawaii to Tahiti using only wayfinding, no instruments at all, and landed almost exactly where he intended. The skill hadn't been primitive. It had been precise the entire time. People just stopped believing that because it didn't look like a map. Now flip to a completely different environment, the Arctic. If the ocean seems disorienting, try navigating a flat, featureless expanse of snow and ice where the landscape can look identical for 100 miles in every direction, and where landmarks get buried or reshaped by wind overnight. Inuit navigators solved this with a level of environmental literacy that borders on absurd. Wind direction leaves consistent patterns in snow, called sastrugi, and an experienced traveler could read the ridges the way you'd read a street sign, even at night, even in a whiteout, by feeling the snow's texture through the runners of a sled or the soles of a boot. Some Inuit navigators built small wooden maps, carved with the coastline's contours, that could be read by touch in the dark, tucked into a mitten and felt rather than looked at. Stars, when visible, helped too, but a surprising amount of Arctic wayfinding happened by feel, not sight. You try explaining to someone from a city that you can navigate a frozen coastline with your hands. They'd assume you were joking. Deserts posed their own version of the problem, and the Bedouin of the Arabian Peninsula answered it with a combination of star knowledge, wind patterns, and an intimate memory of terrain that could stretch across generations. Certain dune shapes form consistently depending on prevailing wind direction, so a Barchan dune's crescent shape actually tells you which way is which if you know how to read it. Combine that with fixed star positions and a memorized mental catalog of watering holes, rock formations, and old trade routes, and you get navigation that functioned across some of the least forgiving terrain on the planet, long before anyone thought to draw it on paper. So when did actual maps show up, and why did it take so long? The earliest known maps are surprisingly old. Small clay tablets from Mesopotamia dating back roughly 5,000 years, showing rivers and settlements in rough schematic form. But for most of human history, maps were rare, expensive, often inaccurate, and largely useless for the kind of moment-to-moment decisions real travel demands. A map could tell you a river existed. It couldn't tell you which way the current pulled today, or where the sandbar had shifted since last season. That kind of knowledge lived in people, not paper, and it stayed that way for thousands of years after the first maps existed. The shift toward map dependence is startlingly recent. Widespread, standardized, Genuinely reliable maps for ordinary travelers are largely a product of the last 2 or 3 centuries, and true real-time positioning is only a few decades old. Most of human history was navigated by memory, pattern recognition, and sense, not paper. Here's the detail that tends to stick with people. All of these systems, Polynesian wave reading, Inuit snow texture, Bedouin dune shapes, required something modern navigation has almost entirely engineered away: sustained, first-person attention to your surroundings. A GPS route doesn't ask you to notice anything. Traditional navigation demanded that you notice everything, constantly, because missing a single cue could mean missing an island, or a coastline, or a well. Some researchers who study these traditions argue that this kind of navigation actually built a different relationship with the environment altogether, less like consulting a tool and more like reading a conversation the landscape was already having. It's not that ancient people had better eyesight or sharper instincts by nature. They simply couldn't afford not to pay attention, so the skill got built, generation after generation, until it looked almost like magic to anyone watching from outside it. It also explains why so much of this knowledge was oral rather than written down. Writing it out would have flattened it. You can describe a wave pattern in words, but the navigators who actually used it were reading subtle interactions between swells that shift depending on season, weather, and the specific island being approached. That's not information that survives well on a page. It survives in apprenticeship, in years spent lying in the hull of a canoe, feeling the water move, or walking a coastline enough times that the ridges in the snow start to mean something. Once European contact, colonization, and eventually motorized transport disrupted these traditions, an enormous amount of that accumulated knowledge simply had nowhere to go. It wasn't written in a book that could be reopened later. It lived in specific people, and when those people stopped being needed, in the way society stopped needing skills, some of it disappeared within a generation or two. So the next time your phone loses signal and you feel a flicker of genuine panic standing on a street corner, it's worth remembering that for the overwhelming majority of human history, this was simply the normal condition of moving through the world, and people handled it by building some of the most sophisticated pattern recognition systems humans have ever developed, most of which never touch paper at all. You didn't lose the ability to navigate without a map. You just stopped needing it long enough to forget your ancestors were experts.